What is up, guys? Frosty Aussie here today for another Frosty Features. Today, we have a character that isn't exactly new to Marvel Strike Force, but she is new to Marvel Strike Force. So already we have Phoenix. We have the release of the character of Jean Grey, so separate from Phoenix. So we're gonna talk about that. So that's for our Uncanny Avengers, our Immortal X-Men. So, which is very big. Today starts, as of this recording day, today starts our Ultimate 32 tournament, and Immortal X-Men. Everyone's prepping against that. So here we are. So what this is, the image of Frosty Features, what this is a comic book background on the tunes that you use in Marvel Strike Force, and I am your guide through the pages of the years past. So, with that in mind, let's begin. According to Scopely, what this is the blog post description that Scopely gives us of a new character coming to the game, and I will read this to you because I am I'm a storyteller, and we will rate this at the end of the feature. So, Jean Grey discovered her telepathic and telekinetic abilities at a young age after a tragic accident awakened her mutant powers, allowing her to read minds and move objects with her mind. She joined the School for Gifted Youngsters, where she honed her abilities and became one of the founding members of the X-Men. Using her powers to protect a world that feared mutants, Jean became a compassionate and powerful hero dedicated to fighting for peace and understanding between mutants and humans. I read that backwards, but it's the exact same thing, so we're going to go ahead and call that good. So that is the blog post description. As I said, we will rate that at the end of the feature. In the meantime, this is my favorite picture of Jean Grey because I'm from the 90s. Jean Elaine Grace Summers is Jean's actual name. First appears as X-Men #1 all the way in 1963. Jean Grey is one of the founding members of the X-Men. Technically, in lore, she is the last of the founding members to join the team, even though her association with Professor X actually, in canon, predates the formation of the team, which is fun. Powers and abilities: telepathy, empathy, telekinesis, and the Phoenix Force. So, one of the big things I wanted to make different, or to separate Jean Grey from, as Marvel Strike Force is doing for the sake of this character, is keeping her separate from the Phoenix Force. It's going to be hard not to talk about her and the Phoenix Force because they very much are so simpatico. So it will be brought up multiple times, but I'm going to try to really address Jean without the Phoenix Force, okay? For context, since 1963, the majority of her content is her with the Phoenix Force. So it's kind of hard to dodge around. But regardless, we will do our best. But the Phoenix Force is a big thing. Essentially, the Phoenix Force is the fire of life itself. It's the fire of creation. So ultimately, her using the Phoenix Force gives her access to any powers. And then outside of that, she is an Omega level mutant, and she is an Omega level telepath, empath, and telekinetic. So she essentially is the top of the line mutation as far as her actual strength and control of these things, especially as you get closer to modern comics. One of my favorite modern comics, for those of you playing Marvel Mystic Mayhem, where Nightmare is the big bad, one of my favorite modern comics has her soloing Nightmare very easily. Like, not even kind of, just for context. So she solos a big bad without any problem. No Phoenix Force needed, right? So be aware, Jean Grey is wicked strong. Also, this is very much my taste of the women is because of the 92 X-Men, Jean Grey. Aliases: Marvel Girl and the Phoenix. So for the most part, we are called Jean. Outside of that, Marvel Girl is the name she goes back and forth on, even in the I think it was right post Jonathan Hickman run Modern 2020. She's going by Marvel Girl again, even though she's been around for 50 years. And then of course the Phoenix, right? A big we'll talk about that in a second. Keep going. Affiliations. So Jean Grey, essentially, if it has to do with mutants, Jean Grey is involved with it one way or the other, but for the most part, she is involved with the X-Men and any variation therein. So lots of different, Uncanny, X-Men Gold, X-Men Blue, X-Men Red. It doesn't really matter. Ultimately, one way or the other, she may, throughout the process, she will cross paths with that form of X-Men, right? Jean Grey very much is a cornerstone X-Men member. Very much we're going to talk about X-Men Red a little bit later. Very much is one of these big reflections of Professor X. So, pretty much always see that. And then we also see the Quiet Council, which is the, essentially Illuminati equivalent of the people running, Araco, and Coco and all that such. So, yes, ultimately, Jean Grey equals X-Men. Background. So, Jean Grey is born to her parents, Elaine and John Grey, in Annandale on Hudson, New York. She's raised outside of the city in this nice little farmhouse. Her dad's a history professor, and she's living a great, wonderful life. But then, who died? Because you can't be a superhero, supervillain without somebody dying. And in Jean Grey's case, she wouldn't be who she was without the death of her best friend, Annie Richardson. Right? So, we'll talk about that a little bit in depth here in a bit. But, yes, here we are. So, moving forward. Isn't actually her. A big problem with Jean Grey, 100%, is the fact that she is often cloned and or revived, or somebody is taking her shape, her form, looks just like her, is acting like her, is acting for, even if it's Jean Grey in that situation, somebody may be making moves around around what's going on, around her conversations, the actions taking place, and make it look like her, which I think maybe it comes down to how powerful she is. If she very much eventually, this isn't really something discussed in canon. This is just something I've noticed in reading comic books. She very much comes off as a person that is, she becomes a sort of figurehead of what mutants are, and I think it has everything to do with how powerful she is. But what happens around her is how everyone reflects. That's what's reflected on mutant kind in general, right? Because we also have Jean Grey going mad with the Phoenix Force. We have her, having the ability to control people, destroy worlds, whatever. Very much is representative of mutant culture as it is, right? Very much the example Charles Xavier gives off. Because as much as we want to give, we could say Charles Xavier is that figurehead. Charles's decisions don't have as he's more vocally influenced, whereas the actions of Jean Grey affects public opinion more so than the actual physical actions of Professor X, if that makes any sense. Especially if you go back through the comics, you'll notice these kinds of things as we swing. Perceived immortality. I mean, her name's Phoenix a lot of the time, and due to the Phoenix Force having this weird obsession with her. And the modern X-Men have the ability to bring their people back to life, coupled with the fact that she has the Phoenix Force, which is the essence of life. She can create life, bring people back from the dead, etc., all on her own. Jean Grey has perceived immortality, even though it is not actually a power that is hers, and you often see her give it up, push it away. There is a point we will discuss, the big point that leads up, I brought up X-Men Red, that leads up to that, is the Phoenix Reborn, Phoenix coming back. That actually ends a 14-year in real life stint where Jean Grey actually dies and stays dead for 14 years, which, for being such a central part to the X-Men, is kind of a big deal that she doesn't come back, especially at the rate that comic book characters often do come back. So there we are. Relationships. So Jean Grey's been around since 1963 and has been in the limelight essentially that whole time, obviously minus the 14-year period I just referenced. But even so, she's brought up in context a lot in that 14-year period. Therefore, there's a lot of relationships, a lot of love triangles, things like that going on. Very famously, the love triangle between her, Cyclops, and Wolverine, even though that's debatably not a love triangle because really the Wolverine situation's not reciprocated. almost at all. But anyway, with that, John and Elaine Gray are her parents. We have Madeline Pryor, used to be very prominent in Marvel Strike Force lore, not lore, well, also lore, I guess, but the Marauders used to matter. She was the round 2 Marauders that made them good again for the short period of time. Multiple siblings. I'll probably reference her older sister Sue later, but for the most part, I'm not really going to talk about them. Scott Summers, most notably, is her husband. They separate, get back together. Scott's kind of a dick. He definitely is not a good husband. So there's a lot of going back and forth on that and whether or not they're going to stay together, etc. Very similar, Frosty features Medusa, where I talked about her relationship with Black Bolt. We see a lot of similar things here with Scott if Black Bolt was a complete and utter asshat. So that, and then Nathan Summers, so Scott Summers being Cyclops, of course, for those of you in the back. Nathan Summers being Cable is her genetic son, stepson. There's a lot of alternate reality versions of characters and relationships like Hope Summers, Rachel Summers, etc. that get brought up multiple times, etc. In between some of the stories I'm going to talk about today, there is a gap in which there's alternate reality Jean Greys and alternate reality versions of Jean's granddaughters and daughters and all this stuff kind of pulling up and going around. So once again, she's been around for a very long time, therefore she has a lot of relations, so you can find a bunch. These are really just the ones that I find most important, most notable to point out. Notable events. So we're going to start off with the origin of Jean Grey. So as I previously stated, nice and graphic here. As I previously stated, born in Annabelle-on-Hudson in New York. She is raised, so the way mutants typically work is they get to the age of being a teenager, young teenager. A stressful event usually will happen in their life. This triggers their X gene to enable, and in enabling this X gene, it gives them their powers, right? So at the age of 10, Annabelle and, not Annabelle, that's where they're at. Jean Grey and Annie Richardson are out playing. That is her best friend. They're having the greatest time. They're out playing. They're throwing a frisbee around and having a good time. And Jean throws the frisbee a little too hard. It goes out into the road. Annie runs out there to try to catch it and gets hit by a car. Jean runs over to her and she's freaking out because her best friend just got hit by a car. And her best friend is saying really crazy, sad stuff like, "Oh my God, am I dying? Is this what death is?" And at this point, at a young age, this is advanced for even, most mutants, Jean Grey's powers manifest at this point. Now, here's the big thing about her powers. Her powers grow debatably more than any other mutant in comic book history throughout her stay, right? As we first are introduced to Jean Grey, she's not exactly super mega useful. Like, ultimately, Charles Xavier recognizes there's a lot of potential there, and she has to work it out, she has to grow it, she has to make it work, etc. And so what we find here, when her mutant powers manifest, it's not like Cyclops blowing out a wall or Rogue, like almost killing somebody. What she gets here is she starts hearing people's thoughts. So she's holding her best friend who just got hit by a car, dying in the street, and she accidentally goes into the mind of Annie, and she experiences death firsthand while holding her friend. This sends her spiraling into a deep depression, and she stops talking to people. She recedes inside her room. She becomes the recluse, and her parents are freaking out because they're like, well, yes, her friend died. That's traumatic, whatever. Therapists, ? What do we do? Nothing's happening. Nobody can get her to even talk. And what's going on is because she can't control whose mind she's listening to. So she's having a lot of trouble being able to process this extreme power. So eventually her father, John, remembers meeting Charles Xavier at Bard College at one point, and he reaches out to Charles Xavier, who then shows up. So this is pre-X-Men Charles. There is no gifted youngsters. There's no X-Men, nothing. He is just brought in. This is still Charles Xavier who's exploring, but this is paralyzed Charles. So he gets brought in to talk with her, and this is where he realizes that she has this mutant ability, etc. And so he starts to begin to kind of train her and help her kind of hone in what's going on. Very much, since she won't talk to anybody, the interaction goes, he shows up and he's like, hey, what's wrong, whatever. It goes into her mind, and he sees that she is reliving the instance that her best friend died on repeat over and over and over and over, and essentially experiencing death in real time over and over and over. So he mentally shows her that there's also good still in the world, because at this point she's been doing this for weeks. She has lost any sort of semblance that wants to connect her to Earth, any will to live whatsoever. And he's like, listen, you still have hopes and dreams. They're still in here. And he shows her how to find them within her own mind or whatever, and breaks her out of this cycle. And then more or less Jean comes back. And so she starts seeing Professor X on the reg, and he starts training her to try to be able to close out, to ultimately be able to control her power, so she can read into these different people at will instead of always getting it, right? So Charles also recognizes that she is an extremely powerful empath, but at this beginning, as much as somebody might want to argue otherwise, he doesn't fully comprehend what that means, right? He recognizes that she's a powerful telepath, but there's no way he can tell she will be as powerful as she will be, right? We don't see telekinesis just yet. Around this time so I'm about to talk about, he trains her, and he's like, let's walk through a mall. And all you gotta do is be able to walk through the mall, and it'll be fine. And it's just to be able to tell if she can shut out everyone's mind. There are a lot of people at the malls, not anymore, right? Malls are ghost towns now. But back in the 60s, these were very popular. There's a slide in time scale, too, so depending on who you ask, this probably happened at a different time. But anyway, so we're walking through a mall. There's a whole bunch of people there, and she's trying to keep them out as she gets through the mall. She is unable to do so, and she shuts down her own kind of mental barrier, whatever, and more or less KOs everybody in the mall as so we flee. And Charles is like, she's too dang strong and she can't control her powers. I'm gonna put in mental blocks so that she can't hurt anybody while she's learning how to put together her own power. So he puts in these mental blocks so she can't access her full strength, essentially walling off parts of her brain, more or less. And this gives him the ability to train her, and eventually he will lift these off when she becomes much stronger. But with this, so I say Jean Grey has a lot of growth compared to other mutants. It is because of these mental blocks. He trains her in these sections in such a way that she can fully control her powers, which makes her strong enough eventually to where she can do things like solo Nightmare without the Phoenix Force, right? That's a big deal. So she has those, and so she's continuously meeting with Professor X on the regular. He starts the Academy for Gifted Youngsters and eventually recruits Cyclops, who becomes the first person he trains up, helps control his powers, and he becomes the first X-Men. And then he recruits the others, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and eventually we get Jean Grey thrown in at the very end, who decided to join the team and be Marvel Girl, right? So ultimately, all of that is how we get Jean Grey as it was. This is how we go all the way to having our Marvel Girl as the situation. So from there, we have a lot of things happen, right? So we're jumping from that was everything leading up to 1963 Jean Grey. Now we're gonna jump all the way to 2017 to talk about X-Men Red. So the reason why I want to talk about X-Men Red is X-Men Red is what a lot of people on the internet consider Jean Grey's, because that's what I wanted to show, right? I wanted to separate Phoenix from Jean Grey because, one, they're very conflated. Two, they're separate characters in Marvel Strike Force. So, a retcon, etc., that came from Phoenix being reborn is the fact that Phoenix actually embodies itself as Jean Grey for a short period of time. So they're actually two different characters, so it's Phoenix that looks like Jean Grey. This does come in the form of a retcon, but it does count. So in Marvel Strike Force lore, if they so chose, Phoenix and Jean Grey actually could be two separate characters, and that would actually work. That would work in canon because of the retcon that's there, right? Which is pretty crazy. But ultimately, there is a point after we see the death of Charles Xavier, we have the X-Men split into X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue. These are the different X-Men Gold, X-Men Blue ultimately, after the death of Charles Xavier, somebody has to carry on his legacy, and we have different legacies to carry on. Magneto being the separate but equal kind of situation. As a reminder for those of you who aren't privy, the mutants are always whoever is discriminated at any point in time. As X-Men goes on, that's why they're never not discriminated against as far as comic continuity, right? So that always slides. But in 1963, we have Professor Xavier and Magneto representing Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, respectively. So as time moves on, Charles dies. We have these different ideals, separate but equal. Let's make an island. Everybody can get along. Let's work there. And then, so Cyclops kind of pulls up this, takes the mantle, and then we have Professor X coming back. It's all confusing. Ultimately, Red and they make X-Men Gold and Blue, and then in response to that, for Jean Grey becomes this in-between. It's not separate but equal. It's not everybody can get along. It's, hey, we can make this work, but there needs to be some rules, right? So that Jean Grey emerges as the middle, and therefore we get X-Men Red. And X-Men Red happens, I think it's 2 years after Gold and Blue. So Jean Grey, anyway, with that, she's dead for 14 years. I said that a bajillion times. So ultimately what happens is the Phoenix is like, Phoenix Force can't die. It's an omniversal being, and it is obsessed with Jean Grey, even though there's many hosts throughout comic book continuity. Jean Grey is the Phoenix Force. It is very much, very simpatico, very much how Venom very much thinks that its prime mate is Peter Parker. The Phoenix Force prime person is Jean Grey. So with that, Jean's dead, but the Phoenix Force doesn't want Jean to be dead, so therefore she's not dead. And so the Phoenix Force is also trying to convince a Jean Grey to accept the Phoenix Force into her and to represent the Phoenix Force, etc. So what he does is what it does is bring back Jean Grey into this like fiery cocoon thing, and what it's doing is telepathically creating this city. She's like in this small city where all of these dead X-Men, dead and not dead X-Men, are around. So she's surrounded by her compatriots, and she's having this fun little life and enjoying it. And it's all a farce, and it's just the Phoenix Force very slowly, because the Phoenix Force does not experience time in a linear fashion. Once again, it's an omniversal being. There's only one Phoenix Force, and so it has no constraints of time, especially with its control over life itself, right? So it's taking its time and slowly trying to get its way into Jean Grey's heart, her mind, so that Jean Grey will accept the Phoenix as it is and then introduce her back into her reality is sort of the goal here. But subconsciously, Jean knows she's being messed with by the Phoenix Force, and therefore, once again, Jean is incredibly powerful without the Phoenix Force. So she makes a bunch of psychic things happen. A lot of things are moving around, whatever, in her reality, and this gets inspected by the X-Men, and they find a portal in New Mexico to her cocoon, more or less, in the middle of space. So they follow it, and we have like a time, because this is what happens when you get in the 2020s of comics, right? So there's a bunch of time displacement and reality displacement. So we've got a time displaced Cyclops. So we got like a child Cyclops. We've got a version of Old Man Logan that are a part of this, and they're debating on who's going to go into this Phoenix. It's a Phoenix egg. I said cocoon earlier. It's an egg. I've been playing too much Marvel Rivals. So they're debating who's going to go into this egg, and it ends up being Old Man Logan, and he kind of gets through to her to be like, hey, this is fake. You need to break out of it. And she's like, it is fake. I need to break out of it. And ultimately, she calls Cyclops, the actual Cyclops, not the time-displaced one, the Marvel 616 Captain Krakoa Cyclops. And ultimately, it's like, hey, you can take my life. You can take my life, come back to the world, and you can escape Phoenix. And she's like, sick. Let's do that. So Cyclops gives up her life once again. Cyclops dies more than Jean Grey. I don't actually know that. Let me know in the comments if Cyclops dies more than Jean Grey, but they die. Both of them die a lot. Cyclops dies, and Jean Grey is supposed to be coming back. And I'm not even into X-Men Red yet, right? This is all the stuff leading up to X-Men Red, but it's really cool. So Jean Grey is set to go back, and she has a breakup. There's a breakup moment between her and Phoenix, and it's really cool. It's very well done. If you've ever seen the comic still where it shows Jean in the rain holding a little thing of fire, what it is it starts raining, and she's like, we're not going to be able to work out, guy. We had a good run, but we need to go our separate ways. We're two individuals, and it's going to be what it is. And as it's raining, the Phoenix gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and he's like, yeah, it's like, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we do need to part, and eventually the rain puts out the fire, and that's her letting go of the Phoenix Force. So now we have Jean Grey without the Phoenix Force. She goes back to the world, as it were, and she starts this X-Men Red, which is her own team of Nightcrawler, Wolverine, X-23, Honey Badger, Gentle, and Trinary, and Namor. And so with this, she starts her own X-Men team, and what her goal is to be able to start a new nation, essentially have her goal is to have the United Nations recognize the mutant race as its own nation so that they can kind of start their own thing. So she gets all of her stuff together and goes and pitches this idea to the United Nations. And what she does before it is goes down through all these world leaders. She talks to T'Challa and gets the backing of Wakanda. Because Wakanda is represented at UN, Atlantis is represented at the UN by Namor. She gets the appeal of Namor and goes around to different world leaders, tries to sway their opinion, and then goes to the UN, pitches this idea, and is supported by these various nations, and the motion passes. Everybody cheers, right? The thing is, especially when you're a mutant, things never go right. So the ambassador from the United Kingdom comes up and is like, hey, really good work out there, a lot of respect, you screwed up a lot of my stuff, and you can never win, you mutant scum. And Jean's like, wait, what? This kind of flipped on itself. And then Jean picks up, oh, something's wrong, something's inside her mind. And as she's looking into, oh, something's going on here, the ambassador's head explodes. And if you're talking to Jean Grey and your head explodes, there's a pretty good chance that Jean Grey just blew her head off. And also, by the way, they're in front of everyone, so everyone just essentially sees Jean Grey blow up this person's head, right? Just full-on scanners, blood everywhere, gelatin, ooze, spaghetti, however you want to picture it, right? So this does not bode well. So all of a sudden, we have a whole new slew of anti-mutant protests, etc. So they're kind of forced underground. They go to Atlantis, and so X-Men Red is based, their base of operations, Namor lets them stay in Atlantis, is Atlantis. And so they're trying to figure out what's going on. In the meantime, Storm goes crazy. It goes to Wakanda and uses her storm powers and rips that crap up. And she ends up being apprehended. And what had happened was they get her on the table and they do a little bit of research, and they find out that there's these little micro machines inside her brain that is controlling her, which we can assume is what was controlling the ambassador from the UK. And what it was is a form of mind control that is not using telepathy, but using machines, so Jean couldn't exactly shut it off. And so these are called Centites, and what they end up being able to do is track that back, and they find out that Cassandra Nova, Charles Xavier's sister that we see in Deadpool and Wolverine, Cassandra Nova is interfering and trying to ruin all chances of the mutants having any sort of prosperity or whatever, because that's sort of what she does. So typically she mind controls people as a sister of Professor Xavier would. But in this case, she actually only mind controls Forge, who then creates these Centites that can go into people's ears and mind control them that way. So now that they know, they're like, oh, what are we going to do? Stop her. And Cassandra Nova's like, by the way, I got a giant, at this point in time, they're like, I got a giant helicarrier, and I'm going to nuke it into, like, New York City. Sorry, I just watched Captain America. She said she's gonna nuke Genosha. My bad. So I watched Captain America last night. First Avenger. Rewatching the MCU. Let's go. Cecilia, I'm gonna detonate the nuclear core of this helicarrier into Genosha. Everybody's gonna die. It's gonna be so fun. It's gonna be wild. So at this point, the Avengers and the X-Men team up. They hear about it and get it together, and they're stopping it. Stopping somebody like Cassandra Nova definitely takes a team that is that big. So ultimately, that's sort of where X-Men Red ends, and then we move. That's from there we move. 2017. That's when we kind of move into the Jonathan Hickman run, and things get revamped. So that's another reason why we had a lot of things ending, is that's when everything sort of started over, and we got a really cool run after that. But X-Men Red's a lot of fun, and it very much is Jean Grey leading the X-Men, and she's being awesome, she's being super powerful, and she does not have the Phoenix Force. So it's definitely worth the read, a good time. All the stuff from, in my opinion, from 27 all the way up to 2021, totally worth it. There's that. Next up is power level. Marvel Strike Force doesn't care about power levels, but here on Frosty Features, we do know the way that this works. If you are a multiversal threat, that means that you can end your reality, not just your reality, but all realities, as it were, being able to topple something like the multiverse at a whim. Universal means you can end your reality, perhaps then hop on over to another one and end that one, taking them down one by one. Cosmic means you have power on the small end, being able to take out things like small planetary bodies with enough time and effort, being able to take out something like a solar system or a galaxy. Nuclear means you have power equivalent to that of a nuclear bomb, leveling things like small cities or up to a planetary body. Super Soldier means you are beyond all human capabilities, being able to take out things like a brick wall up to a city block. City means that you are equivalent to a human being, trained to the absolute and utter peak of human perfection. Think about Olympic athletes here. In Marvel, we have a lot of mercenaries, ninjas, secret agents, and things like that that are sitting at this level. And then finally, you have Greg. Greg is the undead Asgardian that's spawned by Hela in Marvel Strike Force, and without an Undying team to back him up or anybody else, Greg is nothing. So due to undead Asgardian physiology, and just because I like to make the argument, I equate Greg to that of a regular old human being. So in the event that I am speaking at the United Nations, and I am asking for sovereignty of all the Frosties of Osties, and I have a bunch of, I'm trying to get support from these other countries, and for some reason, Hela wasn't able to show up, so Greg's representing the underworld, who's now represented at the UN because of random politics. And Greg stands up and he's like, the Frosties of Osties should not have a sovereign nation. And I say, have at ye, fool. And I throw my name placard representing the Osties at his head. And we get into a duel, theoretically, because I am a regular human being that apparently is seeking for sovereign nation, seeking to become a sovereign nation. I theoretically could beat Greg. So, in the case of Jean Grey, I've said it multiple times and I'll say it again, super, super powerful, even referenced as from Cassandra Nova herself, is stronger without the Phoenix Force. That's debatable, but because of the backing of the Phoenix, I am going to include the Phoenix Force in here because they are so compatico. With the Phoenix Force, debatably without the Phoenix Force, Jean Grey is a multiversal threat. The Phoenix Force is an omniversal being. This means the Phoenix Force is bigger than the multiverse as itself. It exists outside of the multiverse and can see all of them going on and existed all of them at the same time. And this force is obsessed with Jean Grey, and Jean Grey is so powerful in this fact that she can have effect on all of these different universes at the same time. Can she necessarily take them out? That's debatable, but because she can have a multiversal effect at a whim, she has to hold herself back. That's the big difference between her and a lot of her. I just realized I drew a parallel between her and Spider-Man earlier, and I'm gonna say it again. Spider-Man always has to pull back, right? Because he's fighting at a city level, and he's trying not to just own all these humans. She, very much like Scarlet Witch, has to hold back what's going on with her so she does not destroy what's going on, right? So, in this situation, my argument is that Jean Grey, on her best day, is a multiversal. Is she the baseline multiversal being? Yes, I do think that if she was any weaker, and you could probably convince, in a good debate, you could convince me she's universal. I do think she is baseline multiversal powerful, but she is that, essentially, the Phoenix wants Jean to become a god over pretty high on the hierarchy as far as the cosmology of the Marvel Universe goes, and she essentially just turns it down, right? That level of power is something to think on, right? So, Jean Grey, I'm making the argument multiversal. According to Scopely, at the end of the day, the only thing that's a little weird here is when they talk about the manifesting of her powers, is that the powers manifest all together, where the telekinesis and stuff happens with the telepathy, and it actually is just the telepathy. But besides that, I think this is actually a really decent intro to a character. It gives you enough background to kind of feel for her a little bit, but you also know who she is and where she comes from. I'm going to say they did it. There was only one little inaccuracy, and it's little. It very much is me mincing words a little bit, and honestly, the event is separated by a couple weeks of Charles Xavier's training. So with that, that is Frosty Features Jean Grey. I hope that you all had a good time. I hope that you all enjoyed it. Please let me know your favorite Jean Grey moments in the comments, or if I got anything wrong, I'd love to hear from you. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe here on YouTube. It doesn't cost you anything but a couple of clicks. As a reminder, I stream at the link above on Sundays, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time, where we do Frosty Features live. I hope that you all enjoyed this. I hope that you all have a fantastic, fantastic weekend. Most importantly, y'all, stay cool.